Hi, my name is John Christensen, and I teach and do research on environmental equity and access in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the Luskin Center for Innovation at UCLA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. Under normal circumstances, we would all be together in one place for a panel discussion. However, in our dispersed circumstances, I would like to ask everyone gathered virtually here from around the country to acknowledge in your own way that we are all speaking from and about the homelands of Native peoples today. We recognize Indigenous communities and cultures as traditional and continuing stewards of these lands and honor their sovereignty, especially when speaking about public lands. Thank you. Public Lands, We the People is a new digital series launched by the Aspen Institute, which fosters leadership based on enduring values and provides a nonpartisan venue for dealing with critical issues in partnership with the Wilderness Society, which has a mission of uniting people to protect America's wild places. The series aims to collect big ideas from speakers, panelists, and the public for the future of our public lands. Constituting 1/3 of the land mass of the United States, public lands offer a critical solution to the climate and extinction crisis and are fundamental to the clean air and water we depend on for life. They also offer critical benefits to communities around the United States, including supporting our mental health and physical well-being, especially important in these trying times. The COVID-19 crisis has cast a very harsh light on inequities and injustices in our country. Epidemiologists speak about the social determinants of health, and some estimate that just 15% of health outcomes are the result of health care. The other 85% are the result of the social determinants of health. This is no different than the social determinants of wealth and economic well-being in our country, and no different than the social determinants of access to parks, public lands, and nature. When regional parks, trails, and beaches shut down in Los Angeles at the beginning of this crisis, nearly half of the residents of LA metropolitan area had no access to nature, since they have no parks within walking distance of their homes. LA is not unique in this respect, and fortunately we have seen some of that access reopen now with safe practices in place, but the disparities remain and will require all of us to work together to keep a sharp focus on equity and access to the outdoors as we hunker down and weather this crisis and move forward in the future. In our conversation today, we hope to reimagine with all of you the promise of public lands in America. We want to see if we can change the narrative from the old paradigm of seeing public lands and especially wilderness as places to escape from community, places limited to the few, and together create a new paradigm where all are recognized and welcomed and we create community. We'll discuss how our current systems of park and public lands can prioritize the needs of low-income communities of color who are being confronted with the worst aspects of our combined crises of COVID-19, economic inequalities, and climate injustices. Our panelists will highlight community-led solutions emerging from the ground up, from a tech platform making it easier to find campgrounds and other outdoor opportunities, to a nonprofit helping create green spaces across Los Angeles, to a network that makes it easier for Black people to connect to the outdoors, each other, and joy in nature. And we want to start with that Black joy. Mapp is the founder and CEO of Outdoor Afro, a national not-for-profit organization with offices in Oakland, California, and Washington, D.C., and a member of the Wilderness Society's governing council. Ruo Versys, a carefully selected and trained national volunteer leadership team of 80 men and women who represent 30 states around the United States, and she shares opportunities to build a broader community and leadership in nature. Ruo?
Thank you, John. It's so great to be reconnected with you, albeit virtually. I also really appreciate your introduction and starting this conversation with a land acknowledgement. I am broadcasting from the East Bay area where Coast Miwok still live. So thank you very much. It's just so essential to recognize the connection of Indigenous people to the lands all around us. I also like to take a few seconds to also acknowledge this moment, a time when Black people are demanding recognition that their lives matter and have value. Where Black people are marching, still marching on the streets to call for an end to the systemic barriers we face every day in society. Barriers that have come into sharp relief and focus as communities across the US confront a pandemic and a climate crisis. It is in these moments of pain and sorrow, but also of hope, that I turn to nature. I turn to nature for healing, for connection, for my health, and ultimately for belonging. So let's all take a moment to breathe, to reflect, and acknowledge the power of nature in this moment. Thank you. Okay, so let's get into the discussion. For those of you who haven't heard of me or Outdoor Afro, let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. I like to say Outdoor Afro is where Black people and nature meet. We celebrate and inspire Black connections and leadership in nature. We are the nation's leading cutting edge network, and we are just so thankful to have been born actually in digital in 2009 and have grown to become a national not-for-profit over the years. And we're helping people take better care of themselves, our community, and our planet. And you know, over these years, we've made some big waves. We have absolutely helped to change the face of conservation, and we're doing it in partnership with conservation organizations like the Wilderness Society, where I am proud to be a governing council member. I think like for the last year or so now, time has really flown because it's been an amazing experience. And it's been a part of my work as a governing council member to help ensure that public lands benefit everyone. And some of you might be wondering, you know, how does a Black woman like me from Oakland find her way into conservation and advocating for the outdoors? Well, the reality is that I've always had a connection to the outdoors. And some of my most formative experiences happened when I was surrounded at my family's ranch in Lake County. Connecting not only in nature, the rustling of the leaves and the trees, feeling the cold water on my feet at the local creek, and the sounds of the birds chirping to each other on our hiking trails. And it was that feeling of joy in community, of laughter, of even talent shows in our family, and even back home in Oakland, gathering for cookouts along Lake Merritt, is where I learned to love nature. So it's been a lifelong journey. And, you know, nature, I will say, has always made me feel welcome. It doesn't discriminate, it doesn't judge, it doesn't exclude, and it's absolutely everywhere. You know, I've been saying more and more, you know, the trees don't know that you're Black, you know, and the birds are gonna sing no matter what money or not is in your bank account. And the flowers are gonna bloom no matter your gender. So nature has this opportunity for us to relieve ourselves of the isms that plague us in every other aspect of our society. But when I started exploring more public lands in my early 20s, getting involved with various clubs and organizations, I noticed that I didn't always see others who look like me or even share my experiences. And I also discovered along the way in my education that you know, the reality of public lands and who they serve and who they represent and benefits is as complicated as the history of our nation. When the US established the original vision for public lands, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities were not a part of these critical conversations. And what emerged was a narrow vision, one rooted in a story of public lands as wild, remote places that white men in solitude could and should dominate. That story may have felt true for many early conservationists, but there were so many other stories to tell, like the story of how Harriet Tubman looked to the stars to help navigate people to freedom through nature, okay? Often in the cover of night. She did not have a GPS. And I also, of course, have learned and looked at the story of the Buffalo Soldiers who helped to build Yosemite, and many, many, many people who have learned about, loved, and protected the outdoors, who have never considered themselves conservationists. So we've always been in nature, but we have not always been seen. And that lack of being seen has had serious repercussions. It resulted in segregationist and exclusive planning processes like zoning and redlining, which in turn resulted in a lack of funding for our local parks and green spaces for communities of color, and especially Black communities. It resulted in a lack of transportation funding to connect communities to nature. It resulted in a narrow definition of what it means to be in nature. And most importantly, it resulted in a lack of representation at decision-making tables when decisions about conservation are made. In 1964, we had a brief window to right this wrong. Just over 50 years ago, we had President Johnson sign the Civil Rights Act into law. And what else was signed at almost the exact same time was the Wilderness Act. Now just imagine if the people writing the Wilderness Act talked to people in the civil rights movement, if we were able to see the connection between the importance of connecting the need to protect vulnerable people and vulnerable places in one conversation, what might public lands, what might the stewards of those lands be looking like and lifted up today as? Luckily, the past doesn't have to be our future. And I don't think it will be. I'm hopeful because of the people on this panel today, people who have been my friends, my champions, my road dogs for a long time, who understand me and this work inside and out. And combined all together with this movement and my conversations with organizations like the Wilderness Society, there is a reimagining of the promise of public lands, and even a redefining of public lands so that they can benefit everyone. And I mean everyone. Today, I see a commitment to making sure every person, young and old, has a park in their community. I see people leveraging the power of technology so that getting to nature can be a seamless rather than maddening experience. I see networks rooted in a sense of belonging so people no longer feel like they're the only ones in the outdoors and feel safe getting into nature. And more importantly, I see a decision-making table that is beginning to look different. This means the solutions we embrace are actually the ones that communities need to thrive on in the face of climate crisis. Societies will require all of us. Success is dependent on all of us. So let's dive into the conversation now to find out how we can best support a new people-led vision for public lands.
Thank you, Ruo. I want to remind everybody who's joined us that if you want to ask any questions, please use the Q&A box that is in the center of the control panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to your questions in the second half of this conversation. I want to now introduce, we're so fortunate today to not just have, not just one, not just two, but three kick-ass, badass female founders of innovative, important outdoor organizations. We have with us Ruo, of course, but also Viviana Franco, who is the founder and executive director of From Lot to Spot, a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating equitable access to parks and food gardens in low-income communities of color. Since 2008, she has helped garner over $50 million in funding for green space projects throughout the LA area.
Oh my gosh.
She has a master's in urban planning from UCLA, go Bruins, and her thesis, From Lot to Spot, a vacant lot beautification project, became the basis of the organization that she founded. Also like to welcome Alyssa Ravasio of HipCamp. Alyssa launched HipCamp in 2013 as an online marketplace designed to help people discover and enjoy outdoor recreation and accommodations. In the process, HipCamp supports landowners to create new revenue streams for their businesses, empowering them to conserve their land and keep it wild. And I want to start with both you, Alyssa, and Viviana, and you know, we've heard from Ruo. What do you think of when you think of public lands?
Alyssa, well, I guess I'll start. Thank you, John, for the introduction. Thank you, Ruo, so much for that beautiful intro and speech, and to remembering to keep Black Lives Matter at the forefront of this work. For me, as a Latina, growing up in a park poor, green space poor community, yeah, for me, public lands was a very different thing. Public lands to me, you know, just meant these wide open spaces, right? You know, thousands of acres protected in, you know, middle America. It never occurred to me, even in this work today, you know, public parks and public spaces. But there's something about the word public lands. I don't know, you know, maybe it's rooted in like the original, you know, indigenous injustices of the treaties with the lands, right? And land management. But that's that word, just the semantics of it, literally public lands, that's what it brings it to mind for me. And the flip side of that is, you know, working in the Los Angeles area in a very urban environment, you know, the lexicon I think of more that are spaces for the people are public spaces, green spaces. That's the term we use, right? However, they define what green space means to them.
How about you, Alyssa? What do you think of when you think of public lands?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, everyone. Really excited to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining as well. Got a good, big group here. I grew up going to state parks all the time. And so for me, when I hear public lands, I think of my little sisters. I think of my family. I think of catching frogs and toads and mudslides down rivers, and really just the really, much like Ruo, really the formative part of growing up for me was on public lands, and was having those experiences where I was kind of a nerd in school, and the outdoors also doesn't know if you're a nerd. And so for me, getting outside was really when I had these first feelings of, you know, self-love and self-worth, and like, wow, I'm strong. I just went across that whole river. Can't believe it. So that's the I guess the strongest and deepest and oldest association for public.
Alyssa, how has the history of public lands and the inequitable patterns of access and representation of America's diverse peoples shaped your mission as a founder of a tech startup to try to help people get outdoors?
Yeah, well, I'll be honest, it's been a learning process, I'd say. HipCamp was something I started from a very, I guess, self-oriented point of view. I just wanted to go camping and it was too hard. And after one trip in particular where I did my best to research it, but still didn't know to bring my surfboard, I just decided, you know, this is too hard and technology can help, and getting outside is really important. And so that's why I started the company, really just with that perspective. And through doing that, really learning more and more about, you know, who has been welcome on public lands and who hasn't. And you know, I'm here on coastal Miwok land as well. And how are they involved in our state park system today and our national park system? And I think we have a lot of very big unanswered questions, and, you know, very grateful and excited to be part of this conversation to reshape the narrative, because it is very needed and very important. And when we look at what's happening with the climate, I think it's very clear that the story and the narrative of conservation today has been too exclusive. We need way more people on board with taking care of our lands and our waters, and we've got to be inclusive to make that happen.
Viviana, you studied planning at UCLA and the frankly racist history of planning in America, and how that has actively, intentionally shaped park poor, low-income communities of color in Los Angeles and around the country. How did that history shape your mission as a founder of a nonprofit?
You know, it might be the other way around. I guess my story was that I grew up in these very park poor. I grew up in a neighborhood that was disseminated by the creation of the last freeway in Los Angeles County, the 105 freeway. And that left a ridiculous amount of vacant lots in my community, which is, you know, Hawthorne, Inglewood. But I went to school in an affluent area where I witnessed, you know, an abundance of tree canopies, walking trails, parks. That's the first, I was 17 years old when I first realized, you know, how the built environment looks different in poor and affluent communities. You know, I've never been one to mince my words or the organizations. For me, and that's what inspired me to go to, you know, study history, study urban planning, do my thesis, you know, from lots of spot, and then convert it into a nonprofit. In taking in low-income communities of color, you have a ton of blight and disinvestment in urban centers. And I speak to the Los Angeles area, with, you know, I'm sure a lot of you folks can relate to in other urban centers. You know, you have an abundance of these vacant, demoralized, vacant lots, but we didn't have any access to green space. And I, you know, it wasn't a novel idea. Many people have done it before, and I stand on the shoulders of giants. And as I did my thesis and, you know, was learning and had the opportunity, you know, we never minced our words to call it racist land use planning. It's land use racism. That is a term. These communities, you know, our communities, low income communities of color, did not just sprout out, they were planned that way, right? And in terms of green space equity, that is just, you know, one of the factors underlying all of the equitable resources that are not available to Black and Brown communities. So I think it's incredibly important, particularly right now, in this movement, in this Black Lives Matter movement in America, where there's been so much talk and so much support. We need to see action from every industry. If you say you're going to fight systemic racism, you need to act on it, right?
Ruo, you're
in our industry, right?
Yeah. Ruo, you're a founder too, and in each of your cases, it seems there is a need, or maybe even what we might call a pain point, if you will, around which you innovated in this space of access to nature, parks, and public lands. what was that point around which you innovated to create Outdoor Afro?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the more I got away from urban areas, the less people I saw who looked like me. And I didn't see people who look like me in the glossy magazines that depict what outdoor leadership looks like. So I realized my background's art history. We had a visual representation, clearly. And so Outdoor Afro used social media when the algorithms were all nice and flat from my kitchen table to help shift the visual representation of who we imagine gets outside. But importantly, who leads outside, right? I was tired of seeing when we did get depicted that we were often depicted as, only children or only low income. And so Outdoor Afro lifts up Black bodies in nature who are strong, beautiful, and free. And that's it's still disruptive, right?
So
In a time when we have Black bodies outside experiencing violence, that to stand up and show that we're not, our bodies and our experiences is not framed by pain or victimhood exclusively. So really Outdoor Afro has been a 11-year overnight success that has been, I believe, helping shape the narrative of who's getting outside, who's leading outside, and who can be at the decision-making tables.
So I think it sounds, that's the joy part of it, I think, too. And I, in our conversations, I've always, you've always pushed me to move from thinking about barriers to access to thinking about building on assets. But I know this, and I think you've talked about that. I know this might seem like a bit of a downer because I want to turn from joy to politics here. And I don't think of it as a downer, though, because I think of politics as a way for us to build more opportunities for joy. And I want to ask you, Viviana, to help us understand something. In Los Angeles and throughout California, indeed across the country, low-income communities of color have disproportionately supported environmental protection and public investments in the environment at a greater rate than white voters. And yet they have not seen a fair proportional share of the benefits of those investments. So what do we need to do to ensure that they do see those benefits so that we can build a strong representative constituency of support for parks, public lands, conservation, addressing the threats of climate change?
What we need to do is hold these folks who are writing these bonds, these measures, or these initiatives accountable. Personally, and my experience and our organization experience here in Los Angeles, we were part of passing this measure in 2016. It's called Measure A. It was a parcel tax measure that would support, the building of parks in Los Angeles County. However, we wanted to make sure, we know there is inequity in access in Los Angeles. There is countless studies. We wanted to ensure, and yes, you're right, John, even in Los Angeles, overwhelmingly, the pollsters, these cool political consultants you hire, right, to Latinos, and I can speak only to this, the Latinos overwhelmingly, if it has anything to do with the environment, water, trees, it's an always yes, it's an always yes. And yet, we don't see those benefits. So what needs to happen is when these measures are being created, whatever wilderness protection measures, urban green space creation measures, not only do we need to uplift our voices, our community's voices to make sure that their needs are being represented, right? Because these are high need areas in terms of access to green space, to nature, to food security. But we need those people at the table, right? This is politics. We can no longer accept the, it is a post George Floyd world. We can no longer accept, these roundtable discussions and let's reform, what we've done. No, we need action. The right fit on the wall. The data's there. We need to hold our politicians accountable, organizations accountable, right? If you're going to ask for money for your campaigns, for your funding campaigns for a specific environmental initiative, it must benefit everyone. And let's prioritize needs.
Yeah, well, let me ask you, I see there are questions coming in from the audience and I want to turn to those, but I first want to ask you, Ruo, the Wilderness Society, where you are a governing council member, profoundly shaped the first chapter of the history of protecting America's public lands. What is the role of the Wilderness Society in shaping the next chapter of that history? I know the strategic plan calls for 13 million advocates taking action to protect public lands. 13 million is a big number, and that can't just look like the old guard of wilderness advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered the question. The Wilderness Society, the reason why I joined the Wilderness Society is not because, they just asked me, one day over a cup of coffee. I've been checking them out for a long time. And it's been almost a decades-long relationship. And in that time, I have seen them grapple internally as well as externally about how to be different, how to right the wrongs or the misinformed past, to create something that's visionary, that's bold, that's even considered risky in some ways. And one of the first things I was able to be a part of was helping to inform the strategic plan. And when I tell you the depth of engagement from both the staff side and the governing council side, as well as many conversations with external stakeholders, I have so much inspired confidence with how we will move forward. But not only that, but like how can it help other organizations who have similar histories think about the enormous resources and audience that they can leverage toward a different type of future that is not just talking about it, but being about it. And like Viviana said, we're tired of talking. Okay, I've been on a lot of panels over the last 10 years.
Well, I'm glad you're on this one.
Well, and I'm telling you, and people have the same question. They're like, well, how do I get more people to come to my park? How do I, be more inclusive? Well, you know what? It starts with you. It starts with, and it starts with relationships. And nothing happens faster than the speed of relationships. And if you're asking me about why people are not coming to your park or why people are not buying your stuff and your organization's leadership looks white, only white, and its governing council only looks white, then let's start there. So I'm thankful in the ways that the Wilderness Society has really started inside and has thoughtfully brought on me, and not as the token me, but as part of many different diverse Black voices in the organization to help inform this way forward. Is it going to be perfect? Is it super aspirational? Well, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And we can't let it stop us from trying, And so I think we should try harder, we should fail faster, and we should keep trying.
You've answered one of the first questions, which I thought was a good one, about we can theorize about this, but if somebody asks, but if we and we talk about it, but then we try to do things, but then the same people show up at our parks. How do we change that? And I think you've answered that question, that it's about relationships, about building relationships. Alyssa, I want to build on that a little bit and ask you, as you scan the field from your perspective across both private and public lands where that offer outdoor opportunities on HipCamp. What are the most important elements to making the outdoors welcoming to all people?
There's so much work to do. And I think the first step is everyone getting on the same page about that and getting over, if you have any defensiveness or like fear or like embarrassment about acknowledging all the wrongs of the past, like stepping past that and getting ready to do the work, because there's so much to do. And there are so many great leaders, two of which are right here on this call with us, that have been working on this for a long time and are ready to lead. And so I think just acknowledging how much work there is and, getting over any fear or embarrassment is really important. Two things I'll point to from my lens that are really important. One's in the past and will continue to unroll in the future, but access to data. I think opening up our data sets and making open data the default for public land, for pollution, for environmental access is critical. I think any barriers to access data are just going to hold us back right now. We need to get that stuff out in the open. Obama's first executive order in office was open data should be the default. And let's keep going. And there's been great work across a coalition of organizations, including Outdoor Afro, REI, Sierra Club, and HipCamp, to help open up data specifically on federal parks and state parks through access land, that I think is making big strides there. And then something in our future that I'm really excited about is we're launching a program. We're calling it the Unity Badge, where in particular, the private landowners who list on HipCamp. So if you're not familiar, HipCamp has public land and private land. We really build on top of the backbone of public land and augment with private land. And we're gonna have a training program where these private landowners who live in rural areas can learn about what it means to be inclusive and safe, and then earn a badge and be rewarded for taking that extra step to educate themselves and really create a safe and inclusive place for everybody to get outside, because healing and getting into nature, as I think everyone's spoken to already on this call, is so core. Something I think a lot about is Trisha at the Napp Ministry talking about the revolution will be led by the well-rested. We have to rest, and we need to make nature a safe place for everybody to rest, and it's not there yet. It is not there.
I like that one. Hey, here's a related, kind of a related one. And in asking this, I want you guys to be perfectly frank, because because I know you will be, and particularly you, Ruo and Viviana. The question is, how do we involve groups like Outdoor Afro and From Lot to Spot in every aspect of public lands decision making? And I want to preface that by saying, whoever's asking that question, be prepared for a no if that's the case. I mean, to be able to listen, like, these folks are already working hard, but like, how do you answer that question? That when they say, how do we involve groups like yours in every aspect of what we're doing?
Well, first of all, I don't need to be involved in every aspect of what everybody's doing, okay? Because I've created something that works for my community, and that it would be great to get support for what I'm already doing versus to be added into something that already exists. The existing frameworks just haven't worked. The existing models haven't worked. And so that's why Outdoor Afro exists in the first place. And so, I think this is a moment where folks have to get used to centering themselves. That just because there's a solution out there doesn't mean you need to be visible in the center of it. Doesn't mean your organization needs to be the author of it to get the grant money for it. And that it's okay to step aside and allow for the innovation and the solutions to come from the communities that design them. Because for me, equity begins with design. And if you've already designed something and it's already flawed, then it's never going to be changed just because I'm involved.
So I think you've perfectly teed up a segue for Viviana there.
Oh, Jesus. John, if you can repeat the question, just repeat the question that was asked.
How do we involve groups like From Lot to Spot in every aspect of public lands decision making?
ask us. Don't just invite us to the room, invite us to the table. And thank you for asking that question. It is something that we deal with and we struggle with since I started this organization from graduate school for 15 years. And it's something that Alyssa talked about, something Ruo talked about, and I want to hit upon it, is that, you know, how when people come and say, we want to support your work of building these spaces in low-income communities of color because that's where the need is. We want to support you. And then you see, you've invested in this community, you've organized for 7 years. This is a personal example that's happening to us right now in Los Angeles. And we work not just in the city of LA, actually. We don't do a lot of work within the city because it's such a bureaucracy. We do a lot of work on the periphery, a lot of the cities that are ignored but have the same demographic and needs. And so we have a lot of groups that are larger than us, that are white-led, and I don't want to apologize, you know, if these words make you uncomfortable. We got to start using these words and these terms to create change, because what we were doing before we didn't create any change, right? So if you want us to be involved, ask us. The idea of, and when Ruo mentioned, you know, always seeing these communities as without, they're low income, disadvantaged, that is true. And it's also true that there is Black excellence, that there is brown excellence, that these people have assets, these communities have assets that they're willing to share. Nobody's asking them. But when these larger organizations with more money, with no footprint, no relationship, and no community investment come in, write the grant, and they see, oh, we just found out about you. You know, you great brown organization, we support you. Here's a stipend. Can you translate this in Español, por favor? That is systemic, that is practicing the oppressor's tools. That is practicing systemic racism. And so we need to end that. When you're, you know, and I'm talking to the general audience, whether you're a person, an activist, a señora, a funder, if you want to invest in a community, do your homework. Who's already investing there? Who's already doing the work? And just because you don't have a 501c3 or a really pretty website or social media present doesn't mean your work is not impactful. We work with a group of farmers, campesinos here in the Watts area of Los Angeles. The most informal group, you know, some of them don't speak or write in English and in their own native tongue, whether it's Mixtec or Spanish, you know, but they gather weekly in a señora's garage, you know, to discuss regular, just, you know, chisme, gossip, but also what is missing, the quality of life in their neighborhoods. What can they do? How impactful is that? And we need to recognize that. And part of, I just want to just make sure that I throw this in, is how crucial it is that we take this moment. I want to ask of you, of the Wilderness Society, of even within our own organization that was built on fighting systemic racism, right, through land use equity, it's how crucial that at this moment we examine our own structures, our own unchecked practices, right, where they didn't, you know, some folks don't know that that's not cool to, you know, to do that to community-based organizations of color that are already doing amazing, valuable work. And then you come in with your grant and you offer a stipend. That's offensive. We are valuable. The work that we are doing are valuable. Don't just value us at the podium, value us in your budgets. Sorry.
And I think, and as Ruo teed up, not just in the implementation, but in the design.
Absolutely, and that's the first step. Oh, yeah. If you want to include us from the very beginning of those conversations, not when it's planned already.
And I think right now, I just want to jump in and just say that there is so much kind of grabbiness happening for diversity, and philanthropy is putting a lot of pressure on not-for-profit organizations to be more diverse and not necessarily giving them the tools and the kind of respect that needs to be in place before even considering that,
Right.
that people are very grabby and will use organizations like ours to fulfill a grant deliverable. And let me tell you something, I've gotten very good at smelling a grant deliverable. And that usually comes in the form of my involvement being asked or invited very late in the process. So don't make us a grant deliverable, okay? Have us be in the design, because people use the word partner, they throw around partner a lot. Partner means different things to different people. And for me, partner is one of three things. It's you already have something baked in that you want to invite us into. People call that partnership. I don't. Then there's the let's co-design something. You take the good of what you do, good of what I do. Let's make something together that's very intentional. That is real partnership. And then the third version is let me give you the financial resources to support what you're already doing because I believe in you. I see you're effective already. And I want to give you the juice to keep going. So I think we also have to get really transparent and clear by what we mean about partnerships from the outset. So that way we know that we're coming into a relationship that has integrity and that we're not being transactionalized and performative.
Thank you. Thank you. Critical, John. And to the audience that's watching, this is not something new. This is not something that Ruo and Alyssa have experienced once, and myself. We've experienced this over and over and over again, where we get tokenized or asked at the last minute because we are, right? The diversity. Don't tokenize us, please. Value our work, value our presence and the voices we represent.
And value our leadership and professional expertise.
Mm.
I want to lift up a question for you all to think about but not answer because of the time, but to think about. And a young person who is starting an outdoor youth leadership organization and thinking that it might become a nonprofit at some point, and is looking for a mentor. How to find a mentor to help a young person create the kinds of organizations that you have. And I'm going to just ask you, I'm going to reach out to each of you and invite the moderators here to invite the person who asked that question to email me and see if we can help connect that person to figure out how to connect to leaders and mentors like yourselves. What I want to ask as a last question for each of you, and it's a pretty big question, but I hope you'll be creative with it and also that your answers will be short, is that we can't go back to 1964 when the Civil Rights Act and the Wilderness Act were passed by bipartisan majorities, overwhelming majorities in Congress. As we historians say, you can't rewind the tape of history. But if we were to reimagine what we could do together now that connects the wilderness to the inequities in city parks across that spectrum of the landscape where you all work, if we could reimagine what we could do together now, what would it look like to you?
The only thing I can think of is involve us from day one. From day one. Not when it's already been planned for us. Not when it's already been, calculated and visioned by folks who know better than people of color, because right, we're disadvantaged and we don't know much. What you do, right? It's that old saying. I think it's a great, what you do for us, without us, is not us. Involve us from day one.
At the risk of sounding a little jargony, like like, what if we created something that said everything we needed to say? You know, the Vulnerable People in Vulnerable Places Act. You know, like, how do we create a new document, a new charge that, to Viviana's point, is inclusive of our voices and that recognizes the connectivity of places and people, and that they're not separate conversations, that those places and the wildlife of those places, they need our protection, and we need those places to be healed. So how about creating a new narrative and bringing the right people at the table to do it?
Building on that, so beautifully said. I think I dream of a fundamental shift, I think, between people and how we think about and plan with land. One where we give people more credit and we acknowledge all the different ways that people can use land and actually have a positive impact on the land. I think when we get people outside, they will fall in love with the land. I believe in E.O. Wilson's theory of biophilia. People will protect what they love. And so if we really build an inclusive park system, we're going to have so many more people who are ready to protect it and can really just take better care of our waters and our lands, which we need.
Any other last words? You know, what I might add in here, you know, we've had one question about what can we do now? What can we do today to address those issues? And I think you've all, you want to jump? Go ahead.
Yeah. Go to FromLotToSpot.org and OutdoorAfro.org and donate to these amazing leaders who are doing incredible work, and take care of yourself. Get outside. Go on HipCamp maybe.
I did. You know what? I mean,
Find a place to rest.
Yes, and I also especially want to emphasize, if you are in leadership, you really, like, this is a marathon, y'all. So I actually took advantage of going to HipCamp a few weeks ago and had a beautiful experience.
Well, and Ruo, I want you to point out that the background that you're sitting against today, I hear, is an actual picture from or last week. Where was it?
Yeah, I went fly fishing on the Yellowstone River, and this is a photograph of exactly where I was, and we're in our raft on the Yellowstone River just last week. And it's a reminder, you know, that we all need the medicine of nature, and us as leaders of, you know, our own organizations, you know, we have people depending on us, our communities depending on us, and we can't lead if we're burned out. And so please do whatever you can. If you want to help, support our organization so that we can also empower our communities for this long haul and deeply loving work ahead.
And I would point out that there are organizations like yours also around the country, since we do, you know, and Outdoor Afro works around the country, and there are different kinds of organizations like From Lot to Spot in different cities around the country, and I know we have a lot of folks from around the country, you know, with us today. I would also end with one other thing, and I was thinking it, you know, again, it's kind of political, but it's not partisan. Some people have asked what could they do right now to support the building of parks in park poor neighborhoods, you know, and connect those to wilderness areas. And I would say call your congressional representative and voice your support for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It passed, the permanent funding for it passed the Senate. It's now in front of the House. When it was passed in 1965, the year after the Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights Act, you know, it set up, it was meant to set up permanent funding for creating new parks. Later, you know, protected public lands, and later it was revised so that now it provides substantial funding for urban parks and urban park improvements as well. So one of the things that you can do today is to help make sure that the Land and Water Conservation Fund is actually permanently funded.
Here to that. And I just
Okay.
I cannot emphasize enough that people should know that these are the parks in your backyard. Okay. I took Oprah Winfrey in February to a land water conservation funded park, Rocky Miller Park in Oakland, California. So these are parks that people depend on. We're talking clean bathrooms. We're talking soccer fields that are well maintained, the things that people really need to feel welcomed in spaces. And so I want to double down, please, let's support the Land Water Conservation Fund.
And it's
if I can triple down, John, on what can
I'm sure you
triple
can.
down on what people can do
I've got to wrap. Yeah, I know, but I've got to wrap up here. I'm getting the signal.
Okay. In federal legislation, yes, but local. Look at the budgets. Look at the budgets.
Okay.
Pressure your local electeds to invest in parks and recs and wildlife access.
And it's bipartisan, which is also an amazing throwback to the spirit of the Civil Rights Act and the Wilderness Act in the 60s. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and everyone who's been in the audience, and invite you to the next session of this series on public lands, We the People, which will focus on the role of national public lands in sustaining a resilient natural network that helps human communities, wildlife, and the larger web of life to thrive in the face of habitat loss and climate change. With the right policies and partnerships, our public lands and waters can provide clean air, drinking water, and refuge for all of us, humans and non-humans alike. I hope to see you there. Thank you, and happy trails, everyone.